When we run Leaders Coach programs, which we've done for well over 20 years, as well as working with individuals, they often ask, is there a kit bag? Is there a toolkit? Is there a list of things, tips, techniques that we can use? And so I'm going to give you some of these now. And the point I want to make to you is you don't need all of them. These are like having a sort of repository of skills here in your back pocket that you can draw on. Often when you're stuck in coaching, and it does happen, when you just get stuck, when somebody's got nothing to say or they don't know where to go or they really feel encumbered by the issue. So what you're just going to hear now is just some thoughts and ideas about things you can do. So just pull these out when you need to. They're all in the Leaders Coach workbook in some detail. So the first one I've already talked about, but I want to come back to it again in a different frame. And that's the notion of exceptions. You know, there's always an exception to any problem. And it's ironic that sometimes those exceptions hold the seed of the solution. Even really persistent, annoying problems aren't there all the time, are they? Although there's always an exception. And so when you have a difficult situation in a coaching conversation, people will often see the problem as something they have, not who they are, if you understand the difference between the two. You know, you look at times when people haven't coped, for example, what's going on? So exception questions search for and identify situations in the past or the present when the problem wasn't as problematic. And this is like deconstructing the problem. I want to give you a specific example of that may help. I was offered a coaching assignment by the chairman of a board to work with the CEO of an industry body. And the chairman's brief was that this was a guy that was really loved by the industry, but internally he was not well regarded. He was a pretty frightening kind of guy. He was a bully. He was pretty foul, used foul language. He had poor disregard for his staff. And essentially people were scared of him. He was an intimidating soul. And the chairman knew this, but was caught between that horrible place where their external clients were loving him. He was a boy, a lad, a beer drinker, a party guy who loved his football, with what he did when he was at work. So he asked me would I coach him. Not the kind of an assignment you take on with relish. So I went to his office, having flown up to the west of Sydney, and was waiting for him in his foyer, which is a very grand foyer with a large reception desk. And the appointment was at 1 o'clock, and the receptionist said hello, and I sat and I waited and waited and waited, something like 40 minutes. And then finally this guy came out. I think it was this guy initially, and he literally walked past me, looked at me, and walked again to the left of the room and went back in a separate door. So he was checking me out. And I went to the receptionist 5 minutes later and said, what's going on? And finally I was called back into, believe it or not, the boardroom. Now, any of you ever been in a boardroom know that they're very intimidating places with a top end and a bottom end. And his EA sat me, guess where? At the top end. And I waited another 10 minutes and he came into the room, and guess where he sat? At the opposite end. I could barely see him. It was almost as though I needed binoculars. It was very, very clear that he did not want me to coach him. And so it was an awkward moment, to say the least. So I looked around the room to see if there's any signals or any signs of anything that could engage him. And I noticed that he had lots of posters of his favourite football team, rugby league as the favoured sport in New South Wales. And I'm a bit interested in the sport. So I made comment on it, and he got a little animated and got interested and started telling me about his sponsorship of the club, and he went with his friends, and it was his great outlet in life. So we had a little crack. We had a little dawning, little opening, and that was an exception. So without being over clever about it, was finding something where I had a point where we could at least commence a dialogue. And it was pretty easy. Of course, getting into coaching was a whole other thing. So I said to him, do you know why I'm here? And his response was, well, yeah, my chairman told me I needed a coach. And I said, you okay with that? He said, chairman can do what he likes. He's the chairman. If he thinks I need a coach, I need a coach. I said, are you engaged in that at all? He said, not one bit. He said, you can coach me for the next 10 years and you're wasting your time and you're wasting your money. But if the chairman wants me to have a coach, I'll turn up. I'll be there. I'll do what I'm told. And I thought, oh, this is going to be fun. This will be great. These are those moments when you either want to run or raise the invoice substantially. So I thought, where do I go with this? And I said, well, tell me about what's that like at work. And he then told me over the course of 10 minutes almost everything the chairman had told me. He was rude, foul-mouthed. He said things like, I'm not interested in people. I hate it when they barge into my office. Most of the people I work for aren't worth a cent. It was horrible. And he acknowledged it. He said, but I'm fine out with our community and our clients. So he did not have a problem with self-awareness, not at all. Now, I'd ask you in listening to this, what would you then do? This is a very self-aware guy who describes his leadership as quite brutal and uncaring. What do you do with that? How do you pick that up? How do you coach this? Now, I have to confess, this was an accident rather than a piece of cleverness. I simply said to him, are you like that all the time, every moment of the day, no matter what? And he said, unsurprising, well, no, of course not. I'm not always like that. So I said, well, when aren't you? And he, in a very clear and articulate way, told me exactly when he wasn't like that. And he said, I remember 3 things. He said, the chairman rings me every morning at 8 o'clock on the way to work. He said, I'm a night owl, so mornings are really difficult for me, and I have to listen to the chairman for an hour on the phone, interfering with my job. And he pointed at me, he said, if you can get the chairman off my back, that will help. And I said, yeah, I think I can do that. And then he said, and I'm also terrible before 10 o'clock. I'm really grumpy, I'm tired. It's not my world. As I said, I'm a late night person. So it really annoys me when people come into my office before 10 o'clock. So can we fix that? Of course we could fix that. I hate people coming in without appointments. And he went on and on and on. He listed several things that work for him, like if people make appointments, if they come in after 10 o'clock, if they don't stay very long. Now, these aren't exactly lovable characteristics, but they were exceptions to the rule of his general appalling behaviour. And so we agreed that we would set up these practices. Got the chairman off his case. He didn't even come to work at all till 10 o'clock from that point onwards. And he softened off a bit. He became calmer. He became less obnoxious. Now, he's not the kind of leader you'd love to work for, but he was much less of a problem. Now, the end of that story is that he resigned very quickly after that, and he went off and did what he loved. He was a very wealthy man. He didn't need to work, and it was getting involved in sport. The point of the story is not that, is that in my mumbling and my concern about what to do, all I did was find an exception to the rule, and we had a great conversation falling out of exception. So if you can find an exception, it really helps. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is something you'll know really well, and that's about great questions. Now, the ability to ask great questions. There's a lot in the guide about questions. There's actually some specific questions that you might ask about. And you will all know from life's journey that there's a big difference between an open question, a closed question, and a slightly closed question. An open question, what's happening with project X, where you can get a lot of data, or a closed question is, are you on time? And a slightly closed is something that sizes the issue, like what are the big 2 concerns here? What are the 2 big issues here? Now, I have a massive bias on this issue. I rarely, if ever, ask open questions in coaching unless I'm rapport building. And it comes back to what I was talking about earlier. It's a bit like asking why. The more open the question it is, the more issues will emerge and the tougher it will be to coach. You will get, if you ask somebody what's happening with Project X, you may curse the day you asked it. Now, I'm talking in coaching. I'm not talking about in normal management life where that's a perfectly valid question. But remember, we're trying to develop and grow somebody here. So what I typically do is I don't ask a closed question because I'll get a monosyllabic answer, is I'll say something like, tell me about your top 2 issues. What are the 2 things that are keeping you awake at night? What are your top 2? And notice I'm numbering these concerns. So I'm sizing it. I'm bringing it down to something I can put my hands around, but also making the other person think about what actually matters. Because they're great about listing issues, but when you size like that, you're actually saying what's really important here. because that's the stuff that we ought to get some action on. So using slightly closed questions is an absolute dynamite coaching skill. Inferences and avoiding them. When you observe a behaviour, all you've got is a video of that behaviour. It's really risky in coaching to infer something is happening. And I talked earlier on about somebody who's perpetually late. You can't then go and say, therefore they don't care, therefore they're not connected, therefore they're not a team player. Deal with the data in front of you. And I had a great example of that, somebody who was perpetually late and watching a leader pull him aside and give him a mouthful about his disconnection and lack of respect. And the truth of it was that he had a severely disabled son who he had to dress every morning, which could take 10 minutes or 2 hours. And he told nobody. And so his lateness was to do with that. Now, imagine if you'd explored that with a different question. Can we have a chat about lateness? What's going on? How can I help? That's a great way to coach, as opposed to inferring that there's a problem that's actually not there. The third one is one you will know from any kind of basic leadership development, and it is basic, but it's so important, and that's feedback. Feedback is really important in coaching because it's how we pulse check. It's how, when we've given somebody an action or a program or a behaviour change, that they've got to get some feedback on how it's occurring. And so in the absence of feedback, people will create their own. Now, this is particularly true for high achievers. If you're not giving them feedback, I guarantee you they will invent their own feedback, usually negatively. In the absence of feedback, they assume there's a problem. So lots of skills about feedback, like being clear, being specific, being genuine, being realistic, and so on. And it's stuff that you would know from your life's journey. So feedback really matters in coaching. Think of it as pulse checking. A couple of other things. These are in detail in Leader as Coach workbook, and that's empathy. You all know the word empathy. It's going to how somebody else feels. And in coaching, being able to do that as best you can really matters. It's very hard to get immersed in somebody else's problem if you don't feel it, you don't have compassion around it. In your workbook, there is an empathy test that you can do, which I would strongly recommend you have a go at. And it'll give you a sense of where your skills lie. So if you can do that when you're able to, that would be great. And then, of course, attached to that is listening. And I'm imagining since you were very young, people have talked to you about the power of listening and just how poor we are at it. We find it really difficult, most human beings, and because we're always projecting our own stuff, our own ideas, our own prejudices, our own views of the world. And you'll know the concept of cueing, when what you're really doing in a coaching session is you're thinking about what you're going to say next and not listening to the person at all. And these things are to be avoided. Again, in the workbook, there's a listening skills test. So you can actually evaluate your own listening skills. And it's based on a considerable body of research on what effective listening looks like. So I'd strongly urge you to do that. And secondly, I'd get you to validate it with somebody else. Just because you think you're listening in that way doesn't mean you are. So a trusted other, a person you work with, just to make sure that what you think is happening in your listening skills are validated by somebody who observes you. And I've already said to you how listening is critical in coaching, because you should be doing an awful lot of that, way more listening than you are talking.